Hi there and welcome back. We ended our last video, Bioeconomy versus Business as usual, with a harsh truth. The enforcement gap exists because accountability relies solely on voluntary compliance, which fails every time profits are at stake. In this systemic crisis, we must ask, who enforces climate justice when voluntary compliance is undeniably failing? Let's step into that courtroom without a judge and see what's missing. The reason this courtroom has no judge is simple: the voluntary compliance trap. The premise is that all international climate agreements mostly rely on nations and companies complying on a voluntary basis, with no direct enforcement mechanisms. Although civil society and indigenous peoples are at the table, their voice is purely advisory. The final consensus is reserved for the sovereign states. The reality is that this system depends heavily on political will. And the result is that accountability fails every time profits are at stake. This systemic failure has defined the enforcement gap for decades despite the scientific evidence. Everything we now call climate policy began long before the Paris Agreement. In the 19th century, scientists started recording the warming trend. By 1979, the first World Climate Conference had already warned about it. Then came 1992, the year the world signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Its goal was simple yet ambitious: to stop dangerous human interference with the planet's climate, while letting economies grow sustainably. From it came the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and the endless series of Conference of Parties. But here's the problem: this entire system was built on soft law, rules you can agree to without being punished if you break them. And that's how the enforcement gap began. From Kyoto to Paris, nations have pledged to cut emissions and protect ecosystems. But the Paris Agreement, while global in reach, is voluntary at its core. Each country decides what's achievable, how to measure it, and how to report it, often with political optimism rather than scientific precision. Outside Europe, even regional accords like Asians or Latin America's escasos rely on goodwill, not on global enforcement. On paper, the architecture looks strong. In practice, it's built on trust. Let's take a closer look at one of the main tools meant to close this enforcement gap: carbon credits and emissions trading. Within the European Union, many sectors like industry, energy plants, and aviation are covered by the European Union emissions trading system. Here, companies must surrender allowances, and if they don't, they face fines. But at the national level, things work differently. Under what's called the effort sharing regulation, which covers transport, buildings, agriculture, and waste, there's no automatic fine when a country misses its target. Instead, the system allows countries to buy credits from others that have overachieved or to carry over their extra emissions into the next period. In other words, the rules stay flexible, maybe too flexible. For example, recent analysis show that Germany and Italy are already projected to miss their 2030 targets by about 10 and 7%, and yet there's no immediate consequence. No payment, no automatic penalty, no judge in sight. That's the reality of our courtroom without a judge. Every 5 years, countries gather to measure progress in what's known as the global stocktake. But when the data are incomplete or the goals quietly shifted, there's no real consequence. The Paris Agreement's transparency framework allows only naming and shaming, no fines, no trade sanctions, no global court. Some nations like Brazil in 2019 and Australia in 2020 at least admitted their setbacks. Others simply stayed silent or revised their baselines to make the numbers fit. And so the result is a system built on goodwill, where honesty is optional and accountability ends at the border. And after decades of goodwill, the results speak for themselves. Promises made, promises missed, and a planet still warming faster, and a system where the truth is optional. Today, voluntary compliance means commitments are made, targets set, and reports delivered. When those targets are missed, countries simply turn to carbon credits. But the reality is clear. Global temperatures keep rising. Emissions remain above domestic pledges. Carbon offsets disguise inaction, not progress. Forests fall, oceans warm, species vanish. Goodwill without law and without enforcement leads to ongoing destruction. The phrase "a courtroom without a judge" reflects a global reality. We have climate justice claims, but no universal authority to enforce them. The gap persists because climate law is fragmented, causation is hard to prove, and most commitments remain non-binding. As a result, human rights courts and national judges have become the last resort for climate accountability. We have proven the core problem, the systemic crisis of climate justice. The Paris Agreement trap is that despite the signatures of 200 nations, this entire structure fundamentally has no international enforcement. It relies on voluntary action. There is no mandatory monitoring and transparency built into the framework, and therefore there are no formal penalties for failure to meet goals. This entire mechanism is broken by design. If we are to move from a failed framework to a functioning code, we cannot trust the honor of the same architecture that failed us for decades. We must ask the essential question: what can be done to create a judge for this courtroom? The Paris Agreement trap proves that its core failure is not a lack of commitment, but the absence of ultimate authority. The logical next step is to create what is missing: a judge. Imagine a global climate voice, an authority completely independent of national political cycles, lobbies, and special tendencies. Its sole focus: planetary survival. This authority must be empowered to ensure that survival takes precedence over the right to self-rule in climate matters. The point is not to nullify sovereignty, the backbone of nations, but to recognize a higher, non-negotiable law for the survival of the species, including us. This is the hard law required to make commitments real. Thank you for watching. Throughout this video, we've identified the core problem, the climate enforcement gap, where the global community is missing an ultimate voice or judge. The existing environmental laws, whether international or national, are failing. The Paris goals are not being met because the soft law cannot force the change we need. In our next video, we will explore the frontiers of hard law, specifically the law of the sea and national forest law. We will search for the legal architecture that can finally challenge sovereignty and make planetary survival the supreme law in climate matters. See you in the next video. Bye!